So welcome everyone. Sorry for that little bug, but I'm glad that looks like everyone's able to make it. Kerri and I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about teaching with technology, something that we are all doing now and continuing to adjust to. And this is a framework that we found to be helpful in helping faculty navigate how to integrate technology into their teaching. So this is the agenda for the next a little bit less than 90 minutes. We're going to introduce the idea of affordance theory and introduce you to the SAMR framework. And then we're going to share a decision-making tool that we created with you. We'll walk you through it, show you how it works. And then we're going to get into small groups and have you play around with the tool for a little bit. Come back to the large group where we'll talk about how that worked out for you. And then we have two evaluations at the end, one for us to help us know better, like how to keep refining this tool, and then one for this session, I think. So SAMR stands for Substitution, Augmentation, Modification, and Redefinition. And it was created by Dr. Ruben Fuentedura in, I think, 2010. And he wanted to create a framework that would help educators think more systematically about how they could integrate technology into their teaching. And this, again, was in 2010, so way before the pandemic, way before everyone was Zooming all the time, but still a time when technology was available and he thought could really be used to enhance education. So he envisioned the S and the A, substitution and augmentation, as a way to enhance your teaching with the addition of technology. And then he envisioned modification and redefinition, the M and the R, as being transformative to education. And so we decided to, or we thought that this was a useful framework to use, but thought that we could modify it further to help faculty understand the different ways in which they could use technology in their teaching. So I want to go over just a few examples. And the way we envision this is that instead of having it framed as a hierarchy, we think that the S, A, M, and R are actually all appropriate to use depending on what learning objectives you're trying to achieve. So instead of thinking that you have to get to redefinition in order to have the very best teaching and learning experience, we think of it as, well, maybe you want to get to redefinition if you want to introduce something novel that you wouldn't be able to do without the use of technology. But maybe if you're trying to get your class online in 2 days, like we all had to do in March, maybe substitution is actually the best way to go. And it doesn't mean that you're doing something less or worse. It just means that you're using substitution because that's the approach that best fits the situation. So substitution really is when educators want to use technology just to meet the same goals that they were able to use without technology. So an example of this is, in the medical school, we used Zoom to facilitate case-based learning. Students have previously been meeting in small groups with their faculty instructors in person, and the best way to facilitate that in the middle of March was just to move that into Zoom. Augmentation is when an educator wants to use technology for a specific purpose to enhance teaching, and when there's a slight improvement that can be achieved through the integration of technology. So an example that we have, and this comes from Dr. Karen Moser, one of our course directors, is that in teaching pathology, she realized that when students could handle digital slides instead of physical slides, they could actually curate their own collection of slides, and then they could also annotate the slides. So this was a way in which she found she was able to augment the learning through the incorporation of technology. The M, modification, is when you want to redesign a learning task, and you also want to be able to redesign an objective. So an example here is usually our students learn physical exam skills in person, but when you do it with videos, there's actually an advantage in that students can rewatch the video and just basically watch it until they understand how that maneuver is supposed to work. In addition, you could simultaneously have students record themselves doing these physical exam procedures in order to add to a collection of teaching resources for other students. And then finally, with redefinition, this is where you can actually do something very different. You can achieve a completely new learning objective through the incorporation of technology. An example that we have here from one of our faculty is that they realized telehealth visits could start to allow physicians or providers to see the physical spaces in which their patients lived. They could start to have family members from across the country join a visit and hear firsthand what was going on. And an interesting thing that happened was they found they were also able to provide better feedback to students because they could join a Zoom room and have that privacy online that is often hard to achieve in the clinical environment because space is so limited. So those are examples of how you can redefine your learning task with the incorporation of technology. So I'm going to turn it over to Kerri now to talk a little bit about affordance theory. I also realized like 10 minutes in that we never introduced ourselves. So I'll just briefly say I'm Candace Chow. I'm Director of Education Research in the Office of Curriculum. And then Kerri, maybe you want to introduce yourself too.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I'm Kerri Shaffer. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Faculty Support for the School of Medicine. Candace, thanks. So, as Candace mentioned, one of the drawbacks to SAMR as it was originally conceived was that it was presented as a hierarchy, which we disagreed with. And we also initially started thinking about affordance theory in terms of technology, that the traditional sort of backwards design where you start with your learning objectives and then later you determine what tools you'll use to achieve those objectives, we thought it's really hard to create learning objectives if you don't know what tools are already available to you. So we started thinking about how important it is for faculty to be aware of what technology and what technological affordances there are so that they can better inform their learning objectives when they're creating them. So we started thinking about affordance theory specifically in terms of technology at first. And affordance theory, basically, it came about as a way to just observe how people interact with their environment. So some really simple examples of affordances are a doorknob affords turning, a light switch affords turning on a light, and well-designed affordances are pretty easy to spot. There can also be false affordances. You might see an underlined bit of text in an online document and click it because you think it's a hyperlink and it's not. And that's just, it's a false affordance. It's poor design. So we started thinking about affordances that way, that faculty need to be aware of technological affordances. But then thinking more about that argument about context and the lack of context, and thinking about how things went in the beginning of the pandemic, we started thinking about situational affordances also. And we started thinking about, again, how if somebody at the beginning of the pandemic were looking at that SAMR model and thinking, and in fact, I did have a faculty member say something like this when she was trying to get her course online. She said, I know, I'm supposed to make it the best it can possibly be. And I said, no, not right now. You're not supposed to try to make it the best it can possibly be. You need to just get it online and, try not to stress everybody out. Like the affordances of the moment, the situational affordances were that people were trying to set up their work home environment. We had an earthquake, we had windstorms, we had power outages, we had all these situational issues that would make the learning difficult if you tried to include something really innovative in your teaching. So at that moment in time, substitution was actually a really good goal to go for. And I spent a lot of my time advising faculty to just try to substitute the best they could the in-person experience. And then over time, as people got more comfortable, as situations got more stable, we could start experimenting a little bit more. Thanks. So already mentioned this, the next one. So I had also worked with a faculty member who was talking about creating a really interactive session for residents. She's super savvy. She's really sound pedagogically, created something really exciting for them, but didn't really take her audience into consideration, didn't think about what their goals were. And it kind of fell flat because they didn't want something interactive. They just wanted her to give them the information. And so that was really disappointing to her. And it's another example of how important it is to be aware not only of the technology that's available to you in your own skill level, but your audience, what they're interested in, what their goals are, what their comfort level is. So we started thinking about this as we revised the model, and you'll notice it's no longer a staircase. In fact, we even kind of went back and forth about what order we should put things in because we didn't want the direction of how people are used to reading to imply that one of these was better than the other. We really wanted to get across that any of these can be the appropriate level depending on your situation. So for substitution, that's the best option when, again, like in the very beginning of the pandemic, we had very little time to plan. People's comfort or discomfort with technology was kind of unknown at the time, but I think it's fair to say that the majority of our faculty had not spent a lot of time doing online teaching. The problem, at least in that moment, felt very temporary. We just need to get this online right now. This isn't our long-term vision for the School of Medicine. And as far as we knew, there wasn't really anything at the moment that was going to improve the situation in terms of the technology. So substitution was a pretty good option at that moment. For augmentation, that's if you have a little bit more time, if either the faculty or the students are a little bit more comfortable with technology, maybe the problem is temporary, but there's a clear solution to improving the situation with technology, then you can go for augmentation. With modification, that's, again, when you have a little bit more lead time. So this is something that as the year went on, people could start thinking about, okay, now that I've done this in sort of an emergency mode for my class this year, maybe I want to still incorporate some of these into the class for next year because some things worked really well. You know, having the chat in Zoom actually worked really well for some students that may not have spoken up as much. You know, there were a lot of things that we discovered actually worked pretty well that people would want to continue to include. So having a little bit more time to plan, having some proficiency, not just comfort, but some proficiency with technology, having a problem that transcends the immediate circumstances. So again, like students that maybe are reluctant to engage in person, then that's something that can be helped with technology, is that they can use something like a chat tool and it's a little bit easier for them to engage. And that the technology could actually significantly improve the learning experience. And then finally, redefinition. And I would honestly argue that this isn't even something that's necessarily important to get to every time, or even anytime. You may teach your whole life and not get to redefinition, and that's fine. But that's when you have significant time to plan, everybody's proficient with technology, and you know that you're dealing with a problem that is kind of complex or wicked, that is not presenting any sort of easy kind of solution, and that you can use technology to create new opportunities for learning. And one example of that would be in the medical school, we consistently have feedback on our graduation questionnaire that the students don't feel comfortable treating patients from diverse backgrounds. And we are trying to figure out how to fix that. And it just remains a very stubborn problem. We haven't been able to fix it. One of the things that we could do is use technology to connect our students with community health workers, with patients that are diverse from throughout the area, and give them a little bit more exposure, give them a little bit more proficiency or competency or humility with other cultures. And we could start to really make some changes in the learning that maybe we can't do on site with the patients that the students are encountering in the hospital. So just one thought of what that might look like. Next slide. So as we were thinking about this, first we were just thinking that we would just share this with people, that you need to think about technological affordances and that you need to think about situational affordances and go be successful with that. But the more we thought about it, the more we thought that it would actually be pretty helpful to design a tool that people could use every time they're designing an instructional event or an assessment, that you can go in and you can answer these questions and the tool will let you know which level is going to be appropriate, and then also recommend some particular tools for you to use in your instruction. Candace, I see you posted the link in the chat. Did you want to add anything to that? Describe the small group activity?
Yeah, I guess first I had the screen shared here just so that you can see what it looks like. What we're going to ask you to do is, in your small group, think of 1 or 2 activities that either you moved online or that you would like to move online or you want to modify by adding technology. And then we were thinking that everyone in the small group could try this on their own, which is why we gave you the link to the tool. And you can play around with these answers. And so, this is, I think if you have a clear plan, you can answer it as if, you have a lot of time and you have used or you are interested in using sim or virtual reality, but you can also play around with this a little and just see what the different answers lead you to, like what recommendations those provide you. We thought that this would just be an interactive way for you to think about these questions that we've posed here with a specific learning activity in mind so that you could see what suggestions the tool directs you to. Is that clear, Kerri? Okay. So
it sounds clear to me. Let's make sure it sounds clear to other folks as well, since I'm pretty familiar with it.
I can go back to that. I have a slide on that. So maybe bringing that up will make it a little bit clearer. So again, identify 1 or 2 activities that could benefit from integrating technology. I would say use the tool at least twice, or maybe each of the 4 of you or 5 of you just takes a different approach, trying out different possibilities to see what aspect of SAMR best suits your needs. And then based on what the survey spits out for you, then you can talk through how you might go about modifying that learning activity. So feel free to speak up with any questions now. And then if there are no questions, then we can move into our breakout rooms. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and move into the rooms? Heather's set those up for us. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everyone. We were hoping that each of the groups would just be willing to share how the process went and what you talked through. And then we are available for questions too, or open to suggestions, anything really that came to your mind as you were using the tool and talking through it.
And also ways to I froze a little bit. Also ways to improve the tool itself. Part of this is data gathering for us to figure out ways. Does it work? How can we make it better?
I'm going to start with just a question because it's something that came up in a group and we were not sure. It's kind of like a technicality, if you want to call it like that. But we got a little stumped with one of the questions because we couldn't understand exactly what we were being asked. And it's the question about the time. I'm trying to get them the number. 1, 2, 3, 4. How time-based is the problem? We took it kind of like for some comments that you made before, like if you're addressing something that is the result, like you need to implement some change for a result of a temporary situation, or if it's, but there could be other interpretations. So just that question was a little like we were not sure.
Yeah, thanks. That's super helpful. That is what we were going for is this something that's always been a problem and will always be a problem and it's worth putting a lot of effort into changing, or is it something that's going to be better by next week and you just need a Band-Aid type of solution? Do you think it would be clearer if there were maybe examples in the list, like to clarify the question a little bit? Or you also don't have to tell us how to make it better. We can think about it. But just if you have any ideas of what might make it easier to understand what we're trying to get to.
I'd suggest seeing if you can wordsmith it a little differently. It becomes more evident when you look at the answer choices. But when you we read the question first and we're trying to consider it before really looking at the answer choices. So that one we were a bit confused. So you might want to think about wordsmithing. I realized that you were trying to be very short.
Thank you both.
I think that one of the, as you look at it, the one that we chose, the problem is temporary, but there's a clear solution for a long-term improvement was, okay, so we're in a pandemic, right? And everything's changing on every level. And so we, in a pre-COVID, the example that we were using wasn't an issue. But now that we've had the chance to assess how COVID's changed teaching and outcomes, it's like, this would improve something that we would have never thought of about ahead, or pre-COVID.
Did you end up coming up with any good ideas for improving the teaching by using technology?
Yeah, I'm going to put my simulation manager on it right now because it was some good stuff.
Excellent. That's helpful to hear. Do you want to share a little bit more, since the other group doesn't have the backstory of what you were trying to work on?
Sure. So I'm Craig. Hi, by the way. I work in the athletic training program, and we just did a simulation with our first year students on taping procedures. But the wrinkle in it is that we gave them an anxiety, stressful situation that they had to do the procedure and deal with somebody in an anxiety state. And so as we did it, right, we were looking for outcomes both with what their procedure practical skill was, as well as the clinical or communication skill. And so we didn't have enough time in the time frame of our simulation timing to do a debrief to really delve into both of those skill sets independently. And so Louise brought up, well, why don't you just video a bad situation and a good situation and have the students look at it and then, feedback off of that. And so we took that and went through that through the survey, and it came up with a modification, which I thought was fantastic. Like, again, I'm gonna put my simulation manager into like, hey, you need to modify what we did so that we can have that feedback for the students to be able to watch something and see how they responded, as well as to what could be a best case and worst case scenario. I don't know. Did that explain what we did?
Yeah, I think sometimes with simulation it's difficult because you can't have a lot of noise on first year students. You have to be discreet on what your outcomes are going to be for each simulation, because they can't pay attention to more than one thing usually until they get, second, third year, and then you add the noise in and make it more complex, and then they can tease those out. So I think just thinking like novice to what they can handle, and keeping your outcomes and objectives discrete to 2 and 3 is always really helpful for that too.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. So that was group 2. Does group 1 want to talk us through a problem and what they discovered through using the tool, or what they didn't discover, if that was the case?
We had a nice discussion of just all of the tools that you have there listed on the initial screening tool references, and so we had mostly a discussion of the different software suites and options and who had used which ones in what settings. And so I think that was very helpful for me to see which types of software suites you're recommending. I know a few, but this helps open additional options. So that was fun.
I'm sorry, I somehow missed that piece. Where is that information?
Just at the bottom of the results page after the survey was completed.
Okay, got it.
We kind of like spent a lot of time in the first part of the survey, so we didn't explore too much the second page.
I did never see that. Thank you.
And we had a good discussion also about ways to take technology out to different communities or settings. I think there are a lot of good suggestions on ways that could expand what's available here in ways that you can bring things that would be even better than bringing in, say, a guest speaker would be to be, via Zoom or remotely in that person's home if that was a relevant, environment that you couldn't really bring students to, but might be really relevant for their education.
That sounds great. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so I think I'm going to share an evaluation tool. So now we would like if you could give us feedback on the tool by filling out another survey about that initial survey. Very meta today. But before I do that, does anyone have any final questions or comments? Or Kerri, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, thanks.
So I'm going to put the link.
I had a quick question. Where do I find this tool once I leave this space? Because I'm not going to remember where to go or the link or.
I think I can just share the link again.
Mm-hmm. We wanted to test it out a few times with a few different groups. So this is our third test. This is our third group. So I think with each group, we get ideas of how we can make it a little bit better. And we wanted to do that before actually publishing it. But I think that we could publish certainly a beta version that would be easy enough for people to get to. And I think our thought too was to include this survey about the survey in the survey so that as people use it, they can tell us what they thought of it. So we can just sort of continue that iterative process.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't think we have anything more to share. And I don't think anyone would be upset if we end early. That's okay, right, Rebecca? To end early. But that's the evaluation tool. We can hang around to the end in case any of you have questions or comments that you want to discuss further with us. But thank you again for coming and for the feedback.
I have a question, Candace. So did you see all those resources? We end up with modification, and that's a list of tips of resources. They're going to be like for each of the modules that list is going to change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are different
Okay.
suggestions, resources for each of the levels, or I should not call them levels because we're trying not to, but for each, the SAMR.
Like for each of the type of things that we're going to do. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.